Hello, my friends. I feel provoked by the French media who keep talking about Artemis and aldosterone. Why? Because I am the author of these two books, We Never Walked on the Moon. Books that often reach first place at the top of their category on Amazon. Books that have very nice, very good, very positive reviews. We're above 4 out of 5 stars, which is pretty extraordinary for such polarizing books. I acknowledge the polarizing nature of the texts. Now, there's one thing. The media launched a preemptive strike because I hadn't even talked about it. I didn't even mention Artemis. But as soon as they saw Artemis leave, they started talking about aldosterone and all that. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank them, for example, France Info, because I was impressed by the diversity of information. That's something that should be pointed out. It's very important. No matter what topic is being discussed, to mention different opinions on that subject. So that's a very good thing. And honestly, it's encouraging for the future. So now I'm going to tell you something. First, I'm going to tell you how I work, how I approach these questions. And we're going to talk about Artemis. But keep in mind, Artemis 2, we'll talk about it in detail once the mission has been completed. When NASA has shared the data, the numbers, and when we have time to look at them closely and analyze them on their merits. Why? Because this whole approach is fundamentally scientific. It's not an approach based on opinion, belief, or feeling. I don't like NASA, so they did something. I'm immediately going to say it's fake. No, that's not the idea. That's not the idea at all. By the way, Thomas Pesquet said, yes, she's angry, she criticizes Artemis and all that. I don't feel targeted since I hadn't talked about Artemis at all. But just so you know, there's no anger at all, really none at all. I appreciate NASA. To be completely honest, when I was a child, I had a t-shirt with the NASA logo. That says it all. So what I wanted to tell you, what I simply wanted to say is that the American establishment is very much into lying. They live in it. They live in it and they live by lying. There are a lot of cases that hit very close to home. Like, for example, the Epstein case. That one is extremely divisive. We can't talk about it. Just the issue of the war in Iran. Trump, the American president, went in 4 weeks from we're going to save the Iranians to I'm going to bomb them, destroy their bridges, power stations, hospitals, and universities. You can see that, unfortunately, the word of the American establishment doesn't have much value. So what I'm trying to tell you is that my opinion, my work, because these books, if you want to know everything, these books, between the first line of the first volume and the last line of the second volume, there are about 12 years. Still, this book, the first volume, at a certain point, there's a place where the text continues. You jump from one paragraph to another. There's 9-10 years between the two. I had stopped at one point. I kept searching, analyzing all of this. And let me tell you something, I'm not trying to attack NASA. Personally, I think between us, I think the political establishment imposed its obsessions, imposed its narrative on the scientific community, which didn't have much choice in the context of the Cold War. There was a race to the moon between the United States and the USSR. The USSR lost the race. The USSR ceased to exist. These things are very important. Today, nobody cares. Today, I mean, look, even Artemis, nobody cares. Sometimes NASA tweets, you have 150 people commenting, but that's not much. Today, bring me an influencer with 1 million followers on TikTok. Now we're talking. But back then, before TikTok, before the internet, people had fun with very little, my friends. So for example, take 1968, we had Apollo 8. It was the first time we were heading to the moon, leaving low Earth orbit, what we call LEO. We had left it, we were heading to the moon. There you have 3 guys in a capsule orbiting the moon, and then they're going to broadcast it in black and white with the voice like that, completely disembodied. And they're going to read you the Bible live. It was a time with those kinds of references. Today, you can imagine it would have been different. He would have declared his new pronouns. He would have declared that he suffers from anxiety, that he has a mental health issue and all that. There you go. Every era has its own references. Every era is different. Now, when it comes to work methodology, I don't just use anything. Let me give you an example. The story about the flag that moves, was actually mentioned by France Info. I didn't talk about it in my books. Why? Because it's actually debatable. If you're in a vacuum and you plant a flag, will it move or not? Well, there you go. Different opinions. Especially since the video is such poor quality, even worse than the footage of the Titanic's departure, that honestly, you can't even analyze it, go frame by frame, try to see anything and all that. No, you can't. You really can't. So I dropped that argument. The other argument I don't use is sentences taken out of context or fragments of sentences like, oh yeah, did you see the Artemis guy said it's the first time we're going to the moon? No, we can't use that. We're still debating. Let's keep it proper. We can't take someone's mistake or a slip of the tongue or someone who's nervous in front of a camera and say, look at what he said, that's proof. No, that's not proof at all. That doesn't make any sense. I can also take a pilot who says airplanes never existed, and then we say, well, there you go, see, they don't exist. No, that's not an argument. So in the books, before writing them, I did a lot of research. I analyzed NASA's narrative. So everything that's written comes from NASA itself. It comes from the official version. And from there, I only kept the points that are really solid. There were other points that were weaker or open to different interpretations. I left those aside. So that's why regarding Artemis today, it's an ongoing mission. I don't want to arrive mid-mission and claim it's fake. I have no reason to say it's fake. I have no reason to say it's true. We have to wait for the conclusion of this story. We'll look at the numbers. If NASA is willing to share them, as I told you, we'll study them on their merits. We have to wait for it to finish. That's it. The Artemis mission launched on April 1st. Let those who think badly of it be damned. It takes off 4 people inside, 1 woman, 3 men. And the goal of the mission is to go for a trip around the moon. Now, pay attention, my friends. This is a very important point. Unlike the Apollo missions, it will not go into lunar orbit. On the contrary, it will stay 8,000 kilometers from the moon. Which is crazy because the moon has a diameter of 3,500 kilometers. Being 8,000 kilometers from the moon, you can see that's a little more than 2 diameters. Let me give you an example. The Earth, the diameter of the Earth is a little less than 13,000 kilometers. It's as if someone came to visit us from a distant galaxy. And then what does he do? He goes around the Earth at a distance of about 30,000 kilometers. You see, that's pretty far actually, considering that the International Space Station is at 400 kilometers. You get it? So what's surprising is that today, in 2026, with all the technology we have now, all the things we know and everything, we're doing less than what we did back in 1968. You see, that's what's truly astonishing. You see? You look at it and say, the Apollo 8 guys, do you know at what altitude they were orbiting the moon? They did 10 orbits at just over 100 kilometers, around 100 kilometers. So the guys in 1968, they entered lunar orbit. They go and they do 10 laps around the moon. And now today we're at 8,000 kilometers. Why? I'll tell you why. There's a reason. I think I know the reason. I'll tell you a story. You know that when you look at planet Earth, it's relatively homogeneous. Yes, there are places with rocks, mountains, others with the sea and all that, but roughly speaking, in terms of density, it's more homogeneous than the moon. Of course, even on Earth, the areas that are the densest, that gravity is a universal force. You take 2 cans of soda from your fridge, there's a gravitational attraction between them. Yes, as surprising as that may be. But it's very weak between 2 cans of soda. Why? Because it really depends on mass. The heavier something is, the more it will attract others around it. So what happens is, if I take my bottle, I don't know where it is, if I have a bottle of water, if I take a book and I take the Earth's attraction is strong enough to really, and if I take a box of those books, I'd have a hard time lifting it. That's gravity. So gravity isn't the same everywhere. Here, I'm in the southern hemisphere, I'm in Mauritius. If I go to Finland, gravity won't be exactly the same on Earth. There's a variation in gravity depending on where you are. Yes, that's true. But be careful, on Earth, the variation in gravity remains very small. And what does that mean? It means that when we have satellites orbiting the Earth, communication satellites, spy satellites, orbital stations, and so on, they have an orbit that is relatively stable because gravity is relatively stable and predictable. Now let's go to the moon, and I'll tell you the big problem with Artemis, and I'll tell you why. It's an issue compared to Apollo. The moon, as we know well today, has very dense areas called Mascons. So there are areas with rocks, like very hard volcanic rocks, you see. Well, there are areas like that, but there are also areas with regolith, areas where you have a very thick layer of dust, flour-like dust like that. So what will happen? The densest, heaviest areas generate stronger gravity. The less dense areas will generate lower gravity. What does that mean specifically around the moon? It means there's a very high variation in lunar gravity. So if you want to make something orbit around the moon, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that your satellite at times will be attracted. So sometimes it will fly over an area with strong gravity, so it tends to lose altitude and speed up. At other times, the gravity will decrease in another area, and so it will tend to rise, you see. And that happens several times per orbit, so it creates an unstable orbit. NASA, India, and many others have lost objects they wanted to put into orbit around the moon. The trajectory, the lunar orbit, is naturally unstable because of the very rapid variation in gravity. So we sent a Grail mission. You can do something else if you want. Work on these two probes that we sent, which started orbiting around the moon. They measure exactly, they communicate with each other, they measure the exact distance between them. Quand celle qui est en avance. Suddenly we go down, then up, the distance shifts, and we realize gravity has changed. And we made gravity measurements around the moon to try to find out which orbits are stable and which orbits are unstable. Stable orbits are the ones along which there isn't a large variation in gravity. Well, there will always be some statistically. There's a compensation phenomenon depending on the location, and we have orbits that require the minimum amount of correction. Okay, that's all good. When was that discovered? When is the Grail mission from? Maybe 2010, 2011? So we have NASA, which in the 1960s claimed it was flying boxes with 3 guys inside, 100 kilometers above the moon. In a context where we now know that the trajectories or lunar orbits are naturally unstable and very difficult. Advanced studies in 2010 and 2011 to find out and to analyze it, you see? So why do the people at NASA today and Artemis 2 stay 8,000 kilometers away from the moon? Well, precisely to smooth out these differences, because the closer you are to the moon, the more you'll feel areas with weak attraction and others with strong attraction. So what happens is that when you move away, you see the moon as a single point with just one constant gravity. So that allows you to go around and come back, not an orbit, just go around and come back. Do you see the difference? Because if they had really gone into lunar orbit, it would have posed the challenge of saying, be careful, they could crash. So yes, up until now, there's what we call the LRO, for example. It's a probe that orbits the moon and all that, a probe managed by NASA with cameras and everything. So someone might come and say in the comments, yes, but Aldo, I know there's a probe orbiting the moon. Yes, that's true. But be careful. You have to know that the risk matrix when it comes to operating equipment or sending equipment somewhere is not the same as when it comes to sending humans. Because actually the LRO, if you lose it, you've lost cameras, equipment, all that. Okay, it hurts, but no one died. When there are people in a capsule, you have to be careful because if something happens to them, it's a different situation. So you see, that's why they kept a very respectful distance from the moon. The Von Allen belt, how did they do it? We'll see. We'll look at the numbers. We'll analyze them when NASA comes back and gives, if they're willing to give numbers that are consistent, we don't know. We'll see about that. Why? Regarding Von Allen, in the 60s, we knew that this belt existed. But what did we know about it? We knew it existed. We didn't know anything else. Yes, we had discovered it. We discovered it at the end of the 50s, but we didn't know much about it. Since when have we known much about that belt? After the 2000s, when we sent several missions, including one that lasted 7 years, to analyze the Van Allen belt in detail, potentially find ways to get through it or something else. But that wasn't known in the 1960s. That's why in the 60s they lied in such a way that, later on we ask ourselves, wait, why do we today have to do so much research, send satellites, use all of human knowledge, when those guys back then did it like it was nothing? That's the problem. So we'll see when the Artemis mission is completed. We know today that they have toilet problems, don't we? They have toilets that cost $23 million. I mean, everything in the United States is huge, especially the prices of things. The other day, there was a guy showing a sandwich and a coffee in Vegas, and it was already $70. And then there are the state taxes, the mandatory tip, and all that. So you have to know that these missions eat up a lot of money. And unfortunately, when you look at NASA's contractors, they're unfortunately the same contractors from the military industrial complex. So that also casts another shadow of doubt on the operations. But we can't have preconceived notions. We're not there. That's not what we're here for. It's a channel that's extremely well managed. So we'll wait once again for them to finish this mission, and then we'll look at things, we'll clear things up. That's it. In the meantime, my friends, the books, if you want to get familiar with cette histoire, with the Cold War, I invite you to look at these books. It's a continuation, Volume 1, Volume 2. This is the first volume, and then this Forbidden Questions is the second volume. Why? Because forbidden questions, in the sense that after the first volume, many questions came up. And then I decided to write a second volume to address exactly those questions. And then to dig even deeper into them, and also to provide the cultural and political layer as well, because it's absolutely essential. Now, there's one thing you need to know. Personally, as I told you, I do all this with a lot of goodwill, including toward NASA. You should know that the political establishment has the final say in these matters, because they're the ones who decide. They're the ones who decide on the budgets. They're the ones who decide who to put in charge of NASA. So really, there isn't much choice. Look at what happened in 2000. It's very important that people don't have to deal with the EPA, which is a very powerful agency. It's the first to have the planet, and for the planet, and for the planet. Gas in the ground. And then there's another thing. It's very gas. Because, wait, you have a groundwater table, you're looking for gas, you're involving the Environmental Protection Agency, etc. You're telling me you don't touch the groundwater tables. That doesn't make sense. Well, later on, we learned that yes, that's how it was. It was more or less imposed by the political establishment. There is comprehensive research today. There are files, there are scientific reports, peer-reviewed by others, who tell you that science is often in this field because of political interference. I'm not even talking about conflicts of interest or any of that. I'm not even talking about internal conflicts. That's another challenge altogether. I'm talking about external interference. Internal interference or conflicts, it's like, for example, there was a time when doctors would advertise cigarettes. You had nurses walking around the hospital with boxes full of cigarettes to sell to patients who were smoking in their beds. I mean, the medical establishment resisted a lot when the first studies started coming out saying that cigarettes were dangerous. Why? Because there was money involved. They were showering the cigarette industry with money. I can even tell you that the cigarette industry is probably the biggest corrupter of science in the world. You can look it up. There's extensive documentation on this. Even now, they're still doing it, actually. They buy universities, they create foundations, and they pay for science. And they are the ones who invented this technique of corrupting science. And then you have people like Macron or others who say, yes, we believe in science. But unfortunately, science, my friends, it's not a well where I can lean in and hear divine truths. No, science is a method. And the integrity of science will depend on the integrity of the people who practice it and the society in which it develops. That's all. If you have corruption everywhere, which is endemic, explain to me why corruption wouldn't be in science. It's as simple as that, you see. So there you have it, my friends. Thank you. I don't want to go on much longer, but it's a big topic. It's a fascinating topic. It's extraordinary when you dive into the secret war, because the Cold War, we called it the Cold War, but fundamentally it wasn't a Cold War. It was a psychological war on the people. On each side, the Soviets, why didn't the Soviets say that the Americans weren't on the moon? That's a question I discuss in great detail. I mean, if you're waiting for the Soviets to tell you the truth, it's not about saying here that the Americans are lying, but that the Soviets are the guardians of the ultimate truth. No, no. I mean, when it comes to lies, deceptions, and all that, they're all the same. Back then, the United States lied all the time, and that's still the case today. And the USSR, which doesn't exist anymore, well, lied constantly, and both sides had files on each other. And for them, starting to go into stories about they're lying, that's nuclear. Because if the United States had been accused of lying by the USSR, they had enough to retaliate. I assure you, they did it because the USSR had skeletons in the closet too, that's all. People might say, yeah, the question was brought up by France Info, but you can't have that many people in on the secret. But that's not possible, and you can't keep a project secret. The Manhattan Project, 100,000 people, the atomic bomb, we only found out about it the day it exploded. Oh yeah, what do you think? Do you think we're going to go to the gardener, go to the painter, go to the welder and tell him, listen, we're going to drop an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Hiroshima, don't tell anyone? Of course not, of course not. You have a badge, limited access. If you ask a question, the police show up at your house. And it's not the local sheriff, You see the counterintelligence agents coming, they can do whatever they want. I mean, it's a culture of secrecy. It's a system of compartmentalization of information, compartmentalization of tasks. You can't just say, yeah, nobody was saying anything. The story of Dieselgate, there were still 750,000 employees at the Volkswagen Group. Why did no one speak up or come forward for 10 years? Because what do you think? The guy who installs the headlights, who puts in the windshield, or the guy who mounts the wheels or something else, do you think they're going to tell him? Are they going to tell him there's a bug, don't say anything, especially don't tell the EPA? No, of course not. It's a hierarchical system, compartmentalization of tasks. People don't know. Even people who worked at NASA didn't know. The Normandy landings, if you want another example, the Normandy landings. They found out like everyone else. On the morning of June 6, 1944, when they saw the ships appear and start bombing, they said to themselves, maybe this is a landing, but they didn't know before. Tu vois? You can't live in a world, let's stay away from stories about the moon or whatever. You can't live in a world thinking that states are chronically incapable, unable to keep a secret, because otherwise, if they had secrets, someone would come on TV and tell them, that's not possible, you can't think that. Regardless of the moon, let's leave the moon aside. That's not a position you can hold intellectually. It's not defensible. We have so many examples that we can refute that position. I could attempt to defend that viewpoint for the sake of debate, but I wouldn't succeed. I couldn't do it. Anyone could break me down with so many counterexamples. Take the Epstein case, so many involved. He spent his life on Avenue Fauché. How many people spoke up or said something? You see? No, the whole issue of secrecy is much more complicated. It deserves a book. Secrecy is horrifying. My friends, thank you for listening to this video up to this point. Really, I know that several times I said this is the end of the video. This time, it's really the end. And then I'll see you in the next one, and thank you for your support and your open-mindedness for watching me up to this point. I know there are people who don't agree with me, who say NASA went to the moon. I respect that. It's not a problem. I don't have a dog in this fight. If you think NASA went to the moon, I'll say I won't lose sleep over it. That's all. It's not a problem. But you have to know that the opposite argument, the counter argument, can be defended. So there you go. And to wrap up, really this time, if you want, when you look at these books, you'll see that there are only 3 kids, there are only 3 or 4, and they're making a lot of noise. There you go. When you read these books, you'll see a lot of contradictions in NASA's story, a lot of flaws, a lot of nonsense, a lot of things that don't make sense. And if we take an Occamist approach, if you use Occam's razor, you'll see that there's only one element. That will bring them together. That will solve all our problems. It's to think that all of this was fake. If you even consider, just for the sake of argument, that it's fake, you'll see that all the problems are solved at once. So, being quite close to Occamist thinking, I'm not a nominalist, but I am Occamist in the way I analyze things. And I think that very, very unlikely the Apollo story from NASA in the 60s and 70s. Artemis, we're going to study it, not in the shadow of Apollo, but we're going to study it on its own merits once this is over. Thank you, my friends, and I'll see you in the next one.